Hello, everybody. This is Gerald Celente, and it's Wednesday, March 22nd. And we're very honored to have with us a man of dignity, respect, intelligence, kindness, and caring, someone who knows about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I'll put him up against anybody in America when it comes to the facts of what it means, what they represent, and how we've lost those freedoms from our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. And here he is, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, thanks so much for being here today.
Gerald, thank you for your generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to be with you, no matter what we're about to discuss. Let's put it this way. The introduction is happier than the substance of the conversation because the world is falling apart.
It's falling apart and being stolen from us. And what really saddens me is how so few people really stand up and fight like we are, and a few others. We can name the names, but this should be a much bigger rally for peace and freedom than we're having, and because it's being stolen from us in front of our eyes. And speaking of stealing, how about that the Fed banksters over there? As Ron Paul says, and the Fed. And now we have that Fed head. Again, you have to have a brain smaller than a pea not to see what's going on. She used to be the Fed head, and now she's our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. Yep, there she is. As I call her, Miss Faccia Brute. and she's come out in telling the people that it wasn't a bank bailout last week. When they bailed out, they gave the depositors of the Silicon Valley Bank all the dough that they had deposited in there beyond the $250,000 that the FDIC insures. But hey, the bigs had tens and tens of millions and hundreds of millions in there, and they lost their money. So we're going to give it back to them, but taxpayers won't pay it. And then she goes on to say just yesterday that everything is just fine in the system. There's nothing wrong with it. And she said, our financial system is a quote, significantly stronger than it was 15 years ago. This is in large part due to post-crisis reforms that provided stronger capital standards, among other important improvements.
She is the center of central planning of the economy of the United States, a concept which has never, ever succeeded in the history of the world. She's, of course, the former chair of the Fed, and now she's the Treasury Secretary. So between her and Jerome Powell, by the way, Jay, as I knew him, lived across the hall from me when I was a senior at Princeton and he was a freshman. I guess we didn't smack him around enough in those days because he went on to become this big government micromanaging chair of the Fed. I'm kidding about smacking around. I'm not kidding about him living across the hall. The Federal Reserve is the arsonist and now attempting to be the fireman. We have inflation. It's caused by the Fed. It's caused by the Fed creating money out of thin air and just putting zeros on the account of Chase Manhattan and Wells Fargo and their other favorite banks. And that's how they bailed out the depositors of Silicon Valley. So it didn't come from tax dollars. It came from a more nefarious place. Thin air. They just added zeros to Chase's account and told Chase to lend the money to whatever entity took over Silicon Valley Bank. They did that for the depositors, not for the investors. How did they make that decision? Politics. All the government does is go where it thinks the votes are. So you want politicians, bureaucrats, making decisions as to who's going to be bailed out and who's not going to be bailed out. Well, it's not our money. The Fed created the money. Well, when the Fed creates the money, it's more cash in the money supply, chasing the same amount of goods and services, and that causes inflation. Wait a minute. The Fed is supposed to fight inflation. Yeah, the Fed is fighting the very inflation that it caused. And by raising interest rates as radically as it's doing, it's suppressing the value of the bonds that it used to sell. So when you go to sell those bonds because you need cash in the bank, because depositors want to take money out because it's too expensive to borrow, because the Fed has been raising interest rates. If you follow all of this, you go to sell those bonds, they're worth a lot less than they were when you bought them, because people can buy the same bonds at a higher interest rate today. All of this proves that micromanaging and central planning doesn't work. We should be able to charge whatever interest we want. Interest should be negotiable, like rent is. Interest is the rent you pay for other people's money. You should be able to go to a bank. Okay, I have $100,000 here. What will you give me, Chase? I'll give you 5%. Well, Wells Fargo is going to give me 6.5%, and they compete with each other. Oh no, we don't have that in America. The Federal Reserve decides what the rates are. The banks don't compete for rates. There is no reflection of supply and demand. There is no negotiating. All right, I want to buy 1,000 widgets and I want to pay for them in bananas. And the widget manufacturer agrees to accept bananas in payment. Oh, no. It's got to be dollars. It's got to be something that we can control. We can't control bananas. I'm using a silly example. But in a real free market, we would be able to use whatever means of exchange we want. Before Lincoln and the Civil War and the Legal Tender Act, banks issued cash. You went to a solid bank, you bought an insurance policy from your own insurance policy. They insured your deposits at the bank, and the banks, whatever the banks issued, was backed up by gold in their vault. This garbage that the Feds issue today isn't backed up by anything.
The garbage which the Fed issues today is not backed by anything. And they just keep pumping it out. This is from the Trends Journal, and we just quoted, it went out yesterday. This is Janet Yellen. She goes on to say that the banking crisis, quote, situation is stabilizing and U.S. banking system remains sound. The Fed facility and discount window lending are working as intended to provide liquidity to the banking system, end quote.
It's so misleading. If it were said under oath, she should be prosecuted for perjury. That's how profoundly misleading it is.
Prosecuted for perjury.
Because, it's not only illegal to lie under oath, it's illegal substantially to mislead under oath.
Yep.
But she belongs to that same mindset. She and Jay Powell and Joe Biden and candidly Republican big government types as well. Paul Volcker, appointed by Republican presidents. These people are all the same.
Yep.
They believe they're smarter than everybody else. Just give them the levers of power and they'll control everything. And don't worry, young Gerald and young Andrew, don't worry. We'll take good care of you. You'll be safe in our hands. We'll tell you what to do. Well, we may need a bank holiday. We won't call it keeping you from getting your assets. We'll call it, this was FDR's brilliance, we'll call it a holiday.
Holiday. We'll have a holiday. We'll steal your money in any